The United States once lost its own capital, and it happened faster than anyone expected, and almost no one talks about it. A foreign army walked in, and no one could stop them. They burned government buildings. They burned the Capitol. They burned the White House. The president had already fled. Imagine your entire government gone while your capital is on fire. So how did this even happen to a country that was supposed to be rising? In 1814, the United States was already struggling in the War of 1812. The war had dragged on, the pressure was growing, and Britain was no longer treating America like a minor annoyance. This time, they wanted to strike somewhere that would hurt. Not a battlefield, not a border town, the capital. Because when you attack the capital, you are not just attacking buildings. You are attacking pride, power, confidence. And that is exactly what Britain aimed to do. But to understand how shocking this was, you need to understand something first. Washington was not a giant fortress. It was a young capital, a fragile one, a city still finding its shape. The United States was still new, still messy, still proving it could survive. So when British troops moved toward Washington, the situation became terrifying fast. And America knew it, or at least it should have, because the warning signs were there. British forces had already been active along the coast. They had already been burning and raiding. They had already shown they were serious, but Washington still felt far away from danger. That assumption would become a disaster. Now here is the part that sounds unreal. British troops marched toward the capital almost like a knife sliding through weak armor. The Americans were not ready. The defense was thin. The response was slow, and the pressure was building. The city suddenly had a very simple problem. It was about to be invaded, and once that reality hit, panic spread. Not heroic panic, real panic. The kind where people stop pretending everything is under control. Then came the government's worst nightmare. The British were getting closer. President James Madison was forced to flee. Think about that. The President of the United States leaving his own capital because it was no longer safe. That is not a small historical detail. That is national humiliation. The center of power was slipping away. The capital was no longer commanding the situation. It was running from it. And once the leadership left, the city became vulnerable in a deeper way. Because now, there was no illusion left. No confidence. No defense story. No neat government image. Just fear. British troops entered Washington and began doing what they came to do. They burned. They burned public buildings. They burned symbols. They burned the places where power lived. The Capitol was set on fire. That sentence alone should feel insane. The Capitol, the building that represented the country. The place tied to law, order, and authority. Set on fire, but they did not stop there. The White House was next. And this is where the story turns from historical event into full nightmare. Because the White House was not just any building. It was the home of the president, the symbol of national leadership, the image people would one day associate with America itself. And British troops burned it too. Imagine that image for a second. The president gone, the Capitol invaded, the White House on fire. That was Washington in 1814. Not a scene from a movie, not a dramatic rewrite, real life. And the city was watching itself collapse in slow motion. But here's the part that makes the story even stranger. The burning was not the end. Something else happened next. A violent storm hit the city. Rain came down hard. The weather turned wild. The air changed. And some accounts say the storm helped stop the destruction. Not in a clean cinematic way. Not like nature arriving with a perfect heroic cue. More chaotic than that. More brutal. More unpredictable. The same sky that had looked over the burning city suddenly became part of the chaos. And that is what makes this moment unforgettable. War on the ground, storms in the air, a capital in flames, a nation stunned. It was not just an attack. It was a collapse of confidence. And that matters. Because the damage was not only physical. Yes, the buildings were destroyed. Yes, the fire was real. Yes, the destruction was massive. But the deeper damage was psychological. America had been hit in the most embarrassing way possible. Its capital had been overrun. Its symbols had been burned. Its leaders had fled. That is the kind of event that changes how a nation sees itself. And after the smoke cleared, people had to ask a terrible question. How did this happen? How did a young country allow its own capital to be taken so easily? That question lingered, because the answer was not one clean explanation. It was a chain of failures, weak defense, bad preparation, overconfidence, underestimation of the enemy. A lot of them split at once. That is how disasters usually work. Not with one giant explosion, with many tiny mistakes that finally become one giant catastrophe. And Washington was full of them. Still, there is another reason this event matters, because this was not just a defeat. It became a lesson, a very expensive lesson. After the burning, America had to rethink how it protected its capital. It had to think harder about defense, about vulnerability, about what symbols actually mean in war. Because once your capital burns, you do not get to pretend symbols are meaningless anymore. They matter. They affect morale. They shape public confidence. They tell the world whether a country is strong or fragile. And in 1814, America looked fragile. Very fragile. But here is the twist history loves to hide. The burning of Washington did not destroy America. It embarrassed it. It wounded it. It exposed it. But it did not end it. In a strange way, it made the country harder, sharper, more aware, less naive. Pain has that effect sometimes. It strips away fantasy. It forces reality into the room. And Washington was forced to face reality. Not the ideal version. Not the patriotic painting version. The real one? The one with smoke, fire, confusion, and a president fleeing his own city. That is why this event still grabs people. Not just because it was dramatic, because it feels impossible. A capital burned by a foreign army. The White House reduced to ashes. The government running for safety. That sounds like something that should happen to somebody else, somewhere else, in some ancient collapsed empire. Not America, and yet it did happen. That is the whole point. History keeps proving that nations are never as untouchable as they think they are. They can look permanent, they can look strong. They can look too important to fail. Then one day, the smoke shows up, and suddenly, the illusion is gone. The burning of Washington was one of those days. A day when the U.S. learned that power can be humiliated, that symbols can be broken, that capitals can burn. And once that happens, nothing feels fully safe again. Even years later, the image stays alive. The Capitol in flames, the White House under fire, the city in chaos. The storm rolling in after the destruction. It is one of those moments where history stops feeling like a timeline and starts feeling like a warning. Because the real lesson is not just that Washington burned, it is that it could burn. That is the frightening part, not the fire itself, the fact that it happened at all. And maybe that is why this story still works so well. It has everything: pride, panic, collapse, escape, fire, storm, recovery. It is a national disaster with a terrifyingly human shape. Because in the end, that is what history often is. Not neat, not clean, not safe, just a chain of decisions, mistakes, and surprises that can turn a capital into ashes in one night. And America never forgot that lesson, even if most people today barely know the story. The Capitol was burned. The White House was burned. The country was shaken. And from the smoke, a harder version of America had to emerge. But the question still hangs in the air. If it happened once, could it happen again?